Thanks for having us. I know a few faces in the audience. It's nice to have some friendly faces. I'm going to give a quick overview of what we do generally for the Tees Rivers Trust, and Henry's probably going to then go into more depth on the species and the habitats that we actually work with. I'm a project manager at Tees Rivers Trust. I've been with the Trust about 5 years, and when I started I was tasked with building up our estuary operations and looking at building up our habitat restoration programmes along the whole of the Tees estuary. So for those of you who don't know us, and those of you who do, that's us. We're small but mighty, is as we say. There are 14 of us in the whole trust. That's our CEO in the middle in his Christmas jumper. It comes out every year and then goes back. And I don't know how old it is, but it does have a certain pungent aroma to it. We are an independent charity. We're part of the Rivers Trust national movement, but we are an independent charity, and we're independent of the National Trust, Rivers Trust movement as well. We take a catchment-wide approach, so we look at improving the quality of water, biodiversity and habitats all the way across the whole of the Tees. So that's the Tees, the Leven, the Skern, the Boulder, the reservoirs and the estuary. And you can see what our ambitions are there. So the Tees is a river of contrast. I don't need to tell you much about that, but we do have some spectacular sites along the river. It has something, there's loads of places that are beautiful, iconic structures like the Transporter Bridge, low force, and it's under pressure. It's not just under pressure at one end, it's under pressure the whole way. So you have a legacy of human activity right the way from the top of the Pennines with metal mines, right the way through along the Leven. You have industrial milling, so you've got a legacy of weirs that have been put in to provide water to power mills. You've got freshwater systems under pressure from development, from housing, from land use. You've got farms that have used water for agriculture, but you then find a legacy of rivers with an absolute sort of straight right angle bend, which is not natural. And so the rivers are under a lot of pressure, climate change, drought, everything. So why start with estuarine restoration? So why do we do estuarine restoration? Put my teeth in. It connects habitats. So the river is one living beast. It goes from one end to the other. What happens at one end affects the other end. It builds resilience to effects of climate change, so it enables the river to recover from flood events. It helps restore eco-engineers, which Henry will talk about later down in the presentation. It improves water quality and biodiversity, and it can help with carbon sequestration. But it's not just at one end of the river. And I love this slide, but this shows exactly why we have to look catchment-wide at this as river restoration. So this is the confluence of the Tees and the Leven, and that's just after there's been heavy downfall of rain. And what you can see is all of that sediment that's come down the Leven from various different activities. It's not one particular activity that causes this, coming down and coming into the Tees, and obviously that then comes downstream and ends up in the estuary. So as a trust, we look at improving sort of some of these, we look at improving measures to sort of stop this happening. So we look at reducing the loading of the sediment in the rivers, so planting native trees upstream to sort of keep the sediment locked on land, looking at land management techniques that hold sediment and better for soil health, looking at minimising contamination from septic tanks or from livestock entering the water body, controlling plant invasive species that can destroy a riverbank and then bring that bank into the water. Looking at flow control, making sure that we can speed the river up when we want it sped up, slow it down where it needs to be slowed down, allowing it to do what it needs to do so that it doesn't cause flooding in the wrong places. And of course, and this is a Leven slide, you've got all of this sort of man-made obstruction. So you've got weirs, you've got lack of fish passage, you've got areas where water builds up behind these structures and then causes flooding. Migratory species can't get up and down because of some of these man-made structures. So So there's all sorts of issues upstream that if we can reduce and minimise, we can improve the water quality that's coming downstream. And this is the Tees Estuary. And we spend most of our time on the Tees Estuary. It is a spectacular place. It's an absolute spectacular place, but it's got its challenges. Not many people realise how significant the Tees Estuary is, though, for global species. It is internationally designated as an area for bird species. There are some of the rarest bird species and invertebrates in the Tees Estuary in the UK, which not many people realise. And this has come about from the industrialisation of the Tees Estuary, because you don't get people building houses, you don't get a lot of human activity, they make their home there. But, as you can see from that picture, we've lost a lot of estuary. So the estuary looked very different over 100 years ago. It's been heavily modified, the land's been reclaimed. Henry's got a lovely slide to demonstrate exactly what impacts they have. There's contamination in the river, better than it was. I grew up along the Tees in the 70s. It has improved. There's a long way to go, but it has improved. A lot of people have very entrenched perceptions of the estuary, both around the Tees and external to the Tees, where they don't see it as a valuable river, they don't see it as a river with any plus points, and therefore you have the politics of economy versus ecology. So it's a very challenging place to be and to work. So we started off working in the estuary in about 2018, where we embarked on creating intertidal habitat, which were our first sort of steps of, can we do something? And the reason why, well, it speaks for itself. The river's been straightened for shipping. It's been made man-made, that's clinker banks there, so you can see there's not a lot of activity, not a lot of habitat there. If you imagine the Tees as almost like the A1 for wading birds, for example, using it as a route for going up and down, foraging and finding their food. If we can create, and it's a theory, we create small patches of intertidal mudflat along that, we're giving them service stations so they can stop. They can get some food, they can rest. The mudflat will provide invertebrates, food, and that's the theory, is we can soften those edges with tiny, tiny parcels of mudflat, creating a patchwork of habitats for species. By doing that, it also absorbs the action of the big ships coming up and down, so it minimises the effect of erosion onto the bankside as well. So we started off, and this is sort of a very hard process, very difficult. There's no access to vehicles. It all had to be done by hand. Those rock rolls were about a tonne each. So a team of about 6 or 7 of us, and I think Henry and I both bear the scars of it still. We basically rolled all of those in position. We put brash bundles at the front. We covered the rock bags with coir. The reason we had the rock bags is we had put coir in before COVID. When we came back to site, they'd been stolen. So we put the rock bags in and wrapped the coir so tightly that they couldn't be taken off, just to prevent that happening. And the reason for that is that creates sort of an environment where when there's a high tide, the mud comes over the top and it keeps it in place, and that creates the intertidal mud flat. So there you have that's the accreted mud. So that picture on this side is actually what's happened over just 2 or 3 cycles of tide, and how quickly you can create that mud. Obviously the obstacles, not just the accessibility, but we did have anti-social behaviour. We had people throwing rocks at us, we had people stealing equipment. Marine licensing, you'd think it was set up to help, but we actually have spent about £9,000 alone on getting licences just to do restoration. Tide, big one. When we're working in a window of about 4 hours. We can't work at high tide, we have to wait till the tide's receding, we have to rush on site, do what we need to do, and then off site. And the cost, it's not cheap, and that's without staff time, so that was nearly £200,000 just on capital, not staff time. So that was our first foray, and that was part of a European funded programme that we were working with partners across Europe to look at these trail sites. We're now looking at further trail sites. We've just put in some islands at Middlehaven, and I don't have any photos, unfortunately, which will do very similar work. We're looking at another site this summer that will be doing exactly the same, and working on that site to do more or less the same, creating that intertidal mud flat. But while we were doing that, we started thinking, what else can we do? What else should we be doing that will naturalise the river? And that leads on to Henry.
Yeah, so hey everyone, I'm Henry. So I was hired about 3 years ago to work on our new species, so largely looking at seagrass and oysters on the Tees. And I've gone backwards.
Yeah.
So if you look at the history of seagrass on the Tees, this green square is historically where it was, and you can see in modern Tees most of that is now land, unfortunately. So the area we have the potential of seagrass on the Tees have really reduced. And oysters, similarly, used to be an active oyster fishery along the south of the Tees, which is now all Tees Works land. So a lot of that habitat's been lost. But this is a picture actually taken from the Ironstone Museum in Cleveland, just showing that there was a really local fishery. So this is on Redford Beach. There was a little oyster bar set up, just serving people their lunch. So yeah, our dream, long-term dream, is eventually the Tees estuary will start looking something like this, with seagrass on every mud flat and oysters sticking up on the rocky areas.
You forgot the mussels.
They'll come later. So yeah, first, what are oysters? So this is my speciality. So they're a marine bivalve, so 2 halves of a shell that opens at a hinge. They can live sort of intertidally to about 60 to 80 metres, depending on who you ask. They're filter feeders, so they feed on just solids in the water or algae. And they're gregarious, which means they like growing on top of each other. Yeah, friendly creatures. In terms of their life cycle, so they're broadcast spawners, so the males release sperm into the water column, that's taken in by the female. Then the eggs develop in the mantle of the female, and then she'll produce about 1 million larvae into the water column that will then float around in the sea for up to 2 months, looking for something solid to land on. And then those larvae will grow a little foot. And I find this really cute. You can see videos of it. So they actually grow like a little foot, and they'll feel around on the seafloor, decide if they like where they've landed. If not, they'll retract the foot and float off again. If they do, that's when they'll start growing their shell, and that's them for the rest of their life, and they'll just settle on that rock. The history of the oyster, they used to be absolutely everywhere. So they were the food of the poor. They were caught in their millions. So this map shows around Europe, every orange patch is where there's evidence for historical oyster reefs. So it's quite hard to see up in that northeast section, but there is sort of an orange line coating the entire coast. So basically any estuary that around the UK used to have oysters in their high numbers. But unfortunately, obviously, we don't have that anymore. And the main reason for that is overfishing. So in London in 1 year, 700 million oysters were eaten. And this is a picture from Victorian times of the oyster festival that used to go on when the first catch came in. They were such an important part of the British economy and society. And along with the overfishing, with reduced water quality, invasive species, they're now 90% lower populations than they were about 100 years ago. And part of the reason for that is the Pacific oyster. So these are the 2 oysters we have in the UK. The native oyster, the European flat oyster, was the most common back 100 years ago. And then the Pacific oyster was actually brought in by the UK government to try and support local fisheries, because as that declined, local populations, coastal populations really suffered. So yeah, the Pacific oyster was brought in to try and boost those fisheries, but it's now sort of a problem species, sort of blanketing salt marshes. But why do we care? Apart from trying to bring back a species that once was everywhere, they come with a whole list of benefits. So, as I said, they're filter feeders. So a single oyster can filter 200 litres of water a day. So if you get that in enough numbers, the amount of particulates and sediment they can take out of the water column is huge. And along with that, they can reduce nitrates in the water column. They can aggregate metal pollutants and take it out of the water. And because they grow on top of each other and form these reefs, they can help protect the coast from erosion. So yeah, like I said, this is how the oyster grow, because they are gregarious and they like growing on top of each other. They make these really cool 3D structures, which leads to loads of benefits. It's just smattering, so including shelter for invertebrates. They've been shown to increase local fishing because they provide that nursery ground for juvenile fish. Alongside seagrass, because they're filter feeders, they make clearer water, which means more sunlight, so your seagrass alongside it can grow. Stabilise sediments, yeah, there's a whole heap of benefits. So hopefully you all agree, it's a great idea bringing them back, but how? So if we go back to our life cycle, we need 3 things, or 2 things mainly. You need reproductive adults, and then somewhere for that larvae to go. So to solve the reproductive adult issue, we put these oyster nurseries in. So it's an outer cage just to protect it from the elements, and then inside you have a single oyster in each of these to hold adult oysters, which will then produce your larvae into your local water. So we have an oyster nursery in Hartlepool Dock, so where PD Portsland is. So we have 25 cages, over 1,000 oysters living in them, and over the 3 years they've been in, they'll have produced about 100 million larvae, which will be floating out to sea trying to find somewhere to live. And as well as being our source of larvae, the cages themselves and the oysters actually attract a lot of wildlife. So we have volunteer sessions every month to check on the cages, see what's living in them, see how the oysters are getting on, check on their survival rates. So if you fancy putting places like that and getting squirted by oysters occasionally, you're more than welcome to come along. But it's been really good for us to see, because oysters haven't been in the estuary and it's had a slightly checkered past, to see how well they do in local water. So we've had over 95% survival of the oysters in the Hartlepool area, and also we've had 45 species associated either living in the cages or around them, including that picture here is the endangered European eel, which is really exciting to see. So the next stage, now we've got the larvae sorted, is they need somewhere to settle. At the moment, there's a distinct lack of hard substrate around the Tees Bay area. It's mainly muddy sediments. So we're looking at seabed restoration. So that involves putting some sort of hard substrate out, preferably shell or natural materials on top of gravel. So then once your larvae float out to sea, they then have this really nice habitat to then settle on. And then what we're looking at this year and trialled last year is, instead of having your oyster larvae producing in one area and hope they find a nursery elsewhere, is take that entire life cycle and contain it within a tank. So then hopefully you can get your larvae settled on the substrate in higher numbers than in the wild. So that's what we built last year. And these are some of the results. So inside the tank, we hung 500 oysters in these cages. It's a 123,000 litre tank, and then we lay about 0.3 tonnes of scallop shell on the bottom of it. And from that, we produced 2,000 baby oysters, which are these little tiny circles on the scallop shell. Each one of those is an oyster spat. So it's called a spat once it started growing its shell. But that's still not quite as much as we hoped to build a reef from. Ideally, every shell would look like that. That was sort of one of the best shells we found. So now, this year, we're looking at how we can improve those numbers, get more spat growing on substrate that we can then put out to sea. With the long-term goal being taking all those shells covered in baby oysters, put them out to sea, and then as they'll grow, they'll form the oyster reef. Now moving on to our second species we've been working on at the moment, the seagrass. So seagrass is the only marine flowering plant. So it's found in shallow coastal waters, down to maximum about 20 meters depth, depending on in really clear water if they get enough sunlight. And then, although it's not a grass, it's called seagrass because it grows in these meadows and that looks like a lawn. But when I say flower, we use the term very loosely. This is a flower. So they reproduce through pollen floating through the water, so they're not trying to attract a bee, so they don't have to look pretty. So yeah, they just reproduce through pollen floating through the water, but then is caught in the other flowers, and then they'll develop these seeds. We have 2 species in the UK. Zostera mariner is the subtidal, grows to maximum 2 meters, and then Zostera noltii is the intertidal. So you'll see it more laying on mudflats. It's a bit weedier and smaller. And similarly to the oysters, they used to be in most sheltered bays around the UK. So this map on the right was recorded historic around the 1800s, extent of seagrass beds, and then the left is what we have now. And even those that are still around are much smaller than they were. And similarly to oysters, we've lost about 90% of seagrass beds around the UK in the last 100 years. Largely, as you've already seen in the Tees, lost to land reclamation. And a very common problem in seagrass is this thing called wasting disease, which is, they think is present in most seagrasses, but due to bad water quality, it's far more prevalent and has wiped out massive meadows. Caused by reduced water quality. But I just love this picture. This is actually in the Netherlands, where there used to be so much seagrass, they used to harvest it for house insulation. And there's also like cross sections of seawalls in the Netherlands where it's just piled up seagrass because they had so much of it there. But they were going out with a sickle to harvest, whereas now we're desperately trying to protect everything we've got left. And similar to oysters, it has a huge range of benefits. So one of the numbers that gets thrown around quite a lot is 30 times better than rainforests, which I think comes from one paper from the tropics somewhere. So we know it's good at storing carbon, but probably not that good. Really good biodiversity, similar to oysters, good nursery ground for fish. It has about 30 times more biodiversity than bare sand found nearby. And also because you've got this flowing fronds in the water, it will slow wave action and protect dunes from coastal erosion. So similar benefits to to oysters in that nursery protection, coastal protection, and as a unit together, could be really good for coastal communities. And how to restore it. So we thought this was going to be easier than oysters because all you need is to find some seeds, put them in the ground and they grow. That's how plants work, right? But unfortunately, it wasn't that easy. So our first year in 2023, we filled up these bags. They're about 20 kilos of sand with seeds inside to stop them moving around. Went down to Northgate, planted them in the sea, and then this happened the week after. So this is throughout the years, the seawall stays nice and still for 20 odd years, and then the week after it moves about 20 meters up the beach. So a week after we planted, we went down to go see how our seagrass was getting on. Found we couldn't even find the bags until we poked through the sand, and they were under about a couple of foot of sand. So attempt 2 this year. New site where the sand isn't going to dump a metre on it in a week. New methods, so instead of the big seagrass bags, we used littler bags, easier to carry around, and also tried planting live plants. Unfortunately, also did not work. So back to the drawing board. So this year, really focusing on growing really strong plants to then put out into the nursery with a strong root system, so they'll handle whatever the Tees has to throw at it. So because of our learnings from previous plantings, we've built what we call TERI, called the Tees Estuary Restoration Initiative. So this is our land-based nursery where we grow seagrass in containers that then get put out into the sea, into outside containers to grow. And this is where we want to try and grow really strong seagrass that will then survive the trials of the Tees. So the first thing we built was our container-based system. So this was to germinate seagrass, so here we can control the light, the salinity, the temperature, give it the best possible start in life, grow it really strong, and also we can trial different sediments. I'll come to that in a bit. And then once it's grown to a certain length, we put it out into the polytunnel where it gets natural light, natural seawater, natural sediment. So once it's had its good start in life, we'll then expose it to what it will have to deal with in the real world, try and toughen it up. So using these systems, we've been trialing different sand and sediment mixtures. So we got sediment from the site we want to plant at, because again, seagrass has not been in the Tees for about 50 years, so we want to make sure it can survive here. So we got sediment from the site, and then we're looking at different salinities to see if planting it slightly further upstream is feasible, where there's a bit more freshwater input. And we found that salinity didn't really change things much, but the really encouraging result was this bar here. Looking at growing it in pure sediment from the site, it had the best growth out of any sediment we used. So in theory, teas is good for seagrass. We just need to make it work. So after looking at oysters and seagrass, we're looking at what now? Obviously, 2 species is not enough to make a healthy ecosystem. So we start looking at what else can we put in that might be struggling at the moment. So focusing on mussels, kelp, maybe more intertidal habitat. And then also, as I showed in the first slide, there's not a lot of suitable habitat for seagrass at the moment in the teas because we've stuck a port on most of it. So whether we can look at that whole catchment-based approach, try and reduce some of the stresses that are causing problems for seagrass downstream, maybe put some Oysters in that will protect some more habitat, and see if we can increase that suitable area for seagrass planting. And then now moving on into the future projects, we'd heard through the grapevine and talking to various people that mussels nationally are a bit in decline. So hired a new staff member to look into mussels, see what's going on, see if we could try and restore them too. And then started looking into it. Turns out mussels are doing really well on the teas. They're growing like crazy. So all these mussels were found just on the linings of our tanks. So we have a tank that pumps water straight from the dock into the seagrass tanks. And then we kept looking around our tanks and thinking, what are these little dots? And there was just mussels just being blown through the pipes and just growing all over everything. So maybe we don't need to do mussel restoration here, but because they are declining elsewhere, we'll see, well, can we grow them here and then translocate them elsewhere to try and help other populations? So that's why we set up the UK mussel network to talk to everyone that wants to look at mussels around the UK and see if we can get that knowledge sharing going. And then another thing that is severely lacking in the teas, as shown by Judy's picture of just a straight canal, is habitat for fish. So we've been looking at what we call our fish hotels. So it's similar to the oyster cages, but you hang certain just 3D structures in there. That just provides that 3D habitat for fish to hide in, rather than just a straight channel with straight banks. And in these cages, we've already had various species of fish hiding in there, including the ones listed here, and the very weird looking spider crabs. So that was being done by our graduate trainee, which every year we get a new trainee just to train them up in estuary restoration and habitat techniques. Thank you all very much for listening. If you want to keep up with what we're up to, here's all our social media links. And any questions are welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Henry. That's brilliant. Thank you. Questions?
When you were talking about you need a sediment for the seagrass, but the hard ground for the oysters. So how are they working together then?
So
how do you select the areas?
they're never going to be exactly in the same spot. So the ideal vision, I think, if we can find it, would be a bay that goes from some sort of intertidal habitat, whether that's mudflat or salt marsh, then onto seagrass on your sandy bay, and then as it gets deeper, then you'll put your hard sediment out, and that's where your oyster reef would be. So then the oysters will protect the seagrass from any major wave action, clear out the water. That's the dream. I think finding the site might be. We'll probably have to put them elsewhere.
One of the things we can do, particularly with the mussels, is we can introduce them further upstream, and they do very similar work to the native oysters. Obviously they're smaller, but we can have a farm, if you like, upstream from the seagrass site, which will then help with the water quality issues, help relieve stresses downstream for the seagrass. So it's that ecosystem approach of that habitat succession that we're looking at doing.
So, sorry, there's plenty of mussels in the teas.
Mm-hmm.
Is there plenty of space for them to attach and start to produce wee colonies?
Yes. So we thought, because we know from talking to people on native oysters and seagrass that we'd get ahead of the curve and start doing something proactively rather than reacting once everything had gone. And so we've been talking to Natural England and Environment Agency, who've done a lot of baseline surveys, a lot of the other restoration sort of people, and it turns out that they've been quite surprised at how prolific the mussels are in the Tees. They're everywhere. They're on dock structures. They've just attached to everything. So we're in the process of getting good populations tested, good sample populations tested for pathogens, because that's the reason for decline around the rest of the UK is it's thought there's a kind of a cancer that's been affecting some of the populations. So just testing to see if the Tees mussels are free of this pathogen, and if they are, while we're getting them tested, we're trying to learn as much as we can about how we can not just breed them on site, but how we can then use what we're doing as translocation to even places like Lindisfarne, where mussels are in absolute decline. So it all started on the Tees.
So the big
You do
difference.
see a lot of mussel shells when you walk on the beaches now.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, the big difference between the mussels and the oysters in terms of habitat availability is the mussels will grow on vertical structures. So any sort of pilings or stuff that'll be covered in mussels, whereas oysters will tend to grow on shell fragments or on rocks on sort of loose ground, which is what we're
And
sort of
is this
lacking.
Pacific oyster a threat?
So up here it's not so much because we've got colder water. They actually don't breed round the northeast coast. Round Devon, where it's warmer, they're starting to cover big mud flats that were historically like bird feeding grounds. So the Pacific oysters tend to be more intertidal, and the native oyster tends to be in deep water. So I think that's the worry, especially for Lindisfarne, because they've got a native Pacific oyster farm up there. Is if the water temperature increases and they start spawning, then their seagrass beds are at threat.
Are they as edible?
Sorry?
Are they as edible?
The natives?
No, as the Pacific ones, as edible as the natives.
Yeah, so
You get them
Pacific.
to eat the Pacific ones and then
Yeah, so
the natives.
if you ever have an oyster at a restaurant, it will be a Pacific oyster. So they're sort of oval shaped because they grow quicker and they're easier to farm.
Oh, so
They're
we
just
don't
more.
always check them, not like that.
Yeah, so most oysters you buy will be Pacific oysters because they're easier to farm and there's just more of them around. So yeah, eat them all, get them out of here. Although I have heard the natives nicer. So
As they take up the heavy metals and things, would you recommend eating them?
no.
That's what I was thinking.
No, they do bioaccumulate.
The
So
theory is you can. Not sure we want to try it.
Well, so yes, they accumulate, but also they know what they can eat and know what they can't eat. So some stuff they take into their shell, they'll spit out as what they call pseudo feces. So food that hasn't gone through their gut, but they clump it up and spit it out. So that's how they really get rid of a lot of pollutants, is by bundling it up and then burying it in the seafloor.
They're not storing them in the bodies as well.
So they will.
Some of the chemicals.
Yeah, it depends what form the chemical's in. I don't know precisely. So some of it they will.
Yeah.
It will be attached to like food particles that they'll eat. Some of it will be attached to sand or inedible particles that they'll spit out. So it'll be a bit of both.
And on the seagrass, I mean, there's quite a lot of projects around the British Isles, aren't there? So are the different localities finding different problems as they try to establish their seagrass?
Yeah, we're part of a network, so we natter to each other all the time about our failures and our successes. We've not had as many failures as some of the projects, I'm quite pleased to say. But it's all, everyone has their own issues, and of course you have guidance that the first project setting up discovered the best ways of doing things initially, and those methods we found better ways of doing it. The Tees are slightly different because we're the only ones that are actually doing this where we've had no seagrass for a while. All the other people doing this work have got beds nearby, or so they've got an idea A, of where to put the seagrass, and B, that it can sort of survive, and they've got the donor sites next to them. We're sort of starting a little bit from scratch, which is why we've kind of, Henry's sort of slided back to the drawing board. We've kind of looked at the guidance, we've tried it, we've ripped the book up and gone, right, we're going to turf the Tees. and the idea is, as Henry said, we've got sort of probably about that big sort of tubs with turfs almost of seagrass in sort of coir or hessian that we'll be able to lift out, secure in place when we do our planting, and hopefully they're matured, they're together, the root systems have meshed. They should then have a little bit more stability when we plant them. Not sure how it's going to go, but nobody else has tried it, so... And we know that the sediment is fine, we know the water quality in the site works, so fingers crossed. This time around we might not get human intervention and we might not get an offshore storm that blows. So yes, I'm sure there'll be something else that happens, but you've got to keep trying. You've got to keep trying.
Have you managed to win the support of the local fishing community for your work? I'm thinking specifically of I'll call them a life form that lives or inhabits a very unique environment at Paddy's Hole, which is these sort of abandoned boats that people have, with a bit of imagination, have converted into, an extraordinary little community there, Peggotty-like. And I wonder how they feel about what you're doing. Is it the kind of division you get between climate activists and the others, or is it have you got their support?
Yes. Not everyone. Not everyone. Our oysters actually, their hoists are on pontoons that are owned by PD Ports, but actually belong also to the Hartlepool Boatmen's Association and the North East Fishing Collective, which you would never get normally in one sentence, I don't think. But we have the North East Fishing Collective are really supportive of what we're doing. They talk to us regularly. They have given us advice, particularly the mussels. Those are the ones that started us, gave us the idea. Constantly asking us questions. Anything we need, they'll help us with. At the same time, we talk to all of the local sort of fishing guys. We have tried to engage with bait diggers. When we were first, our second site, we went down, we talked to the bait diggers. We didn't have any issues with the local bait diggers. It was bait diggers from outside the area, we believe, that have caused issues and dug up some of our planting. We can't do this on our own. It's not up to us to come and put something in and then just walk away. We've got to work with people to make sure they help us look after it. And we learned that with the intertidal work, sort of having everything taken away from us. It was gutting to go back to that site and discover all our hard work had gone. And we learned that lesson very, very quickly, that we have to make sure people they understand what we're doing and they're supportive.
Their knowledge of the local area is invaluable. So when we're looking at where we can put an oystery, one, we want to talk to them so we're not destroying a good potting area, but also they'll know where the fish populations are, where there's rock sediment, where there's muddy areas. We're very lucky they're our neighbours and we can just chat to them as and when. Generally good support.
And with the oysters, the larvae are floating around for 60 days.
Yeah.
So presumably a fair number of those will go out of the teas and get carried in a literal current down the...
Yeah, so that's actually, I'm looking at getting some modelling done for if we stick a reef here, where the larvae end up, because you need at least some of them to stay where the reef is, otherwise the population will die off.
But equally, our crabs sort of come down from Lindisfarne or Blythe or wherever. Presumably the sort of wind turbine structures, I'm even thinking about the scar at Redcar. Are you seeing more oysters? Is there any sign of oysters there, for example?
Yeah, so we've not seen the settlement further down the coast. I think I want to look at putting some Spoitsville spat collectors out, a little stacks of shells to see if you get settlement down the coast.
You could actually measure at a few points.
Exactly. So that's what I'm looking at the moment, is that sort of things, and also trying to get some modelling done to be like, okay, if there's larvae produced here, when will it end up? So then you can be like, okay, so if we stick a little shell here, hopefully the larvae will get there. With
the mussels, what normally eats mussels? Bigger crabs or whatever? Or?
Yeah, so there has been a shift towards mussels in the ecosystem since the mass die-off, so I think that might be part of why. Partly why they're doing so well, because they haven't got that predation pressure anymore.
Right.
There will be some, if they're intertidal mussels, you get some birds that will eat the shells open and eat them as well.
Right.
Or starfish and that kind of thing will get through.
It's such a complicated ecosystem, isn't it?
Yeah.
So many issues. I noticed your the spider crabs. Once again, those probably weren't as prevalent 3 or 4 years ago as they are now.
Yeah.
Because the ecosystem's just changed so much.
Yeah, it's interesting. So in our cages we get way more purples from the crabs. Actually, are the most common. Which is interesting. I don't know whether because because we didn't have this before the dive happened, so we've not been able to measure a shift.
I mean, I guess that's the only thing I'm going to come back to is baseline. I mean, we don't have, as far as I know, we don't seem to have a good, even a pictorial record of what a harbour wall would have looked like, 5, 10, 20 years ago, do we?
Yeah.
So it's awfully subjective information. It's individual fishermen's. I mean, they've got a great view of it, but it is still there. It's very good. There is this mussel, it's barnacle, isn't it? There's a barnacle survey that has been going on for something like 20 years.
Yeah, that's around Jurassic Bay and Robin Hood's Bay.
Yes.
And that there have been some surveys done that obviously stand up to peer review on the work there. I mean, to be fair, we started this in 2021 in the September, and it was probably the worst possible time we could have started looking at introducing some of these species into the Tees, because it was just before we had the crustacean die-off. But equally, we got data from our first efforts post everything. We feed that it's all sort of fed into a national sort of records and into the networks and things. So yeah, unfortunately there's nothing before, which is a shame.
It's good to be building the data up now. I mean, it's this baseline that would be lovely to have. I mean, even the crab, it's still. The catches are real data, but there isn't a lot of data on what a beach looked like before this happened, and so it's very difficult to know if something is, a real difference or not.
Yeah, I think that's the same problem with any sort of restoration is, what are we aiming for?
So coming back up the river to the silt coming out of the Leven, has there been any lessening of that since we've had all the older berms and things put in Stokesley?
It is lessening, so we are working a lot more, looking at developing more projects, particularly along the Leven, because it does have a higher sediment loading than most rivers in the UK, which is so it's a focus river for us for doing this kind of work. It is getting better. We haven't measured recently. We have just submitted funding for more works this summer, so hopefully this summer we will do more works to sort of address some of these issues. So you might see people up and down various places along the Leven doing that work. But it is something that it's a constant piece of work, is to keep that sort of momentum going. It comes from a variety of sources, and I think that's the hardest thing. It's not just one source. You can't just say that's the problem or that's the problem. It's everything from forestry, agriculture, even sort of some of the modifications that have happened. So it's tackling one issue at a time, so it's going to be quite a long process. But that was a side sort of from 3 or 4 years ago, and it has improved slightly.
It certainly increased the biodiversity of part of the invertebrate population.
Yes, we noticed when we were doing the work at the Fat Panda, as I was saying earlier, we came off site, and I remember coming off site that last day of getting everything done, and being met by a very irate gentleman sort of saying we shouldn't be doing that work and how terrible we were going to make it look. And I sort of said, but that's a site. And he hadn't realised how natural it had already looked, because it very quickly took shape, and very quickly we did measure a high level of invertebrates and fish, actually small fry in that river. Within a week of us coming off site, there were higher levels of tiny fish shoals swimming up and down. So nature does bounce back quite quickly if you give it the opportunity.
Why are the eels in such dire straits, given they're so quite the inverse of salmonids, tolerant of pollutants and such likes?
We don't really know. We don't know enough about eels. I think the biggest thing with eels is we don't know enough about them. They're still there's so much we don't know. I was talking to one of our eel experts a few weeks ago, and they were saying apparently when they come from the Sargasso Sea, they split and they go up around the north of the country and around the south. We don't even know if our eels have come from the north or the south. But there's just so much we don't know where they go. We've been tagging, so we started tagging this year, so we tagged some eels to see where they're going, how far up the Tees they go. We measure elvers coming upstream, so we had, how many was it, 800 this weekend? 500, 500 elver this weekend through the fish pass at the barrage. We measure them going up. We don't measure them coming down. So we don't even know how they're getting down and if and how long they take upstream and how long they stay up there. So there's so much we don't know. And it's something we are, hopefully, we're starting to do a lot more research on. The problem is funding. That's always going to be an issue, is getting the funding to do this.
Yeah.
Because it's quite labour intensive, like everything we do. You know, it takes a lot of staff time, and funders typically, they like shiny plaques, they don't like to fund people. And that actually is a major battle for us constantly, is trying to scratch the funds so we can keep people in jobs, so we don't lose people who've built up that expertise, and that we have that sort of long-term plan, and we can do a lot of the research on a long-term basis. Because nature's long-term, but funding is short-term. Normally it's like 2 years, 3 years, and that's not how nature works.
Is it the deforestation and and/or agriculture that's causing all the sediment loading in the Leven? And is that possibly why, unlike the Tees itself, because I can't get a straight answer of the Environment Agency, as if indeed at all, as to why they watched off the Leven and its tributaries. I can remember my grandfather telling me a century ago, he used to bloody spear them down at Leven Bank. There was that many of them. And now there's just, well, nothing.
So it's not just the forestry, so there's all sorts of different issues along the Leven. Forestry is one of them, so we have done a lot of work.
What's one of them, sorry?
Forestry, so it is one of the causes. We do work with the Forestry Commission.
Wrong trees, wrong continent.
Putting the right trees in the right place, rather than the wrong trees in the right place. And that does, we know, it can be quite effective at keeping sediment on land rather than it washing down into the watercourse. It could be anything though, from an invasive species where you have sort of giant hogweed or Himalayan balsam that takes hold, and it creates a monoculture, and it can destabilise that bank and then into the water. A variety of different sources. It's so difficult. You can have land management as well, so farmers sometimes, if they're overusing the land or overworking the land, the soil gets it becomes quite unhealthy, and it doesn't hold the moisture into the water. And there are ways we can work, and we work very closely with a lot of farmers, a lot of land managers, particularly around the Leven. We've been doing that for about 12 years. And actually, we do see a lot of change happening. But again, some of it is dependent on funding. Maybe not for us, but maybe for the people who need that money to make those differences, those sort of infrastructure changes on their land to stop this happening. So it's hard.
The military do some dynamite exploding. Yeah. It's a big success in North America.
Don't tempt us.
Yeah, that's one of our missions, is to try and get rid of these, especially for fish passage.
Yeah.
Get rid of blockages. It's just, takes time.
You mentioned septic tanks. Have you any figures how many septic tanks there are in the Leven?
Off the top of my head, and I can't remember how many it was. I know I gave Helen the stats about a year ago. I think it's about 13% household ownership of septic tanks in the Leven. It is quite a high proportion. And a lot of people don't know how to look after them, and that's an issue.
They seep out a bit.
Oh, really?
So septic tanks, effectively the stuff settles, doesn't it? So the water's still flowing over the top and coming out.
Yeah.
So the main solids settle, but there's still material going out, because otherwise your septic tank would fill up very quickly. So it's not good.
And if you own a septic tank, there are certain things you have to do to look after your septic tank. And again, you get cases where people have bought a house, haven't realised it's a septic tank system. They may have used bleach, for example, to clean the house, and then when you use bleach, it can destroy all the bacteria in the septic tank, and that stops it doing what it needs to do. There's loads of different little things that you have to do differently if you have a septic tank. So again, it's a small thing, but it's a high usage, and again, it's something that we're aware of is particularly rural areas. So it's not just the Leven, it's also upper catchment as well, up in the Pennines, where you do get that as a contributory factor. I mean, the other one is things like road runoff as well. You know, it's not just landowners, it's not farmers, it's everything. It's, you know, sort of highways where they're higher than a water body, and of course the road, you get a rate of downfall, and you get pollution from tyres and rubber, and that goes into a water body. So It's a combination of factors.
Is there any type of code of the Pacific coast is already right now accepted in Northern Arctic and Vietnam and down south? Are they doing anything?
Could you repeat the question? Sorry, Claire, you were a bit quiet. Do you want to...
Yeah, so you're asking if they're doing anything about the sort of Pacific oyster problem down south?
Just accepted that they're doing that?
So Kent Wildlife Trust is the one I know more about. They have a sort of oyster bashing program where every week they get a group of volunteers to go on the beach, and every time they see a Pacific oyster, they hit it with a rock to try and keep the populations down. But I think where they are breeding, it's sort of they just produce too quickly to really get rid of them. It's a hard one with Pacific oysters because if they're subtidal and they're forming a reef, like basically what we want the native oysters to do, then they are providing that filter feeding, that habitat. It's just when they're in the wrong place, it's an issue. So I think basically they're trying to harvest them around Devon when they're really high populations just to keep it at check. But I think now they're there, they're there forever now. They're going to be impossible to get rid of completely.
How do you get some type of invasive seaweed as well?
Yeah.
I suspect it's come through on the oysters imported.
Oh yeah.
Japanese wine, small, down south, not here.
Yeah, similar with boat ballast as well. We get a lot of invasive species coming in through that ballast water.
Same with the signal crayfish as well.
Yeah.
When they built the Calgary Reservoir, they put them into the reservoir. So I found massive claws up there off the signal crayfish, huge claws inside the reservoir.
Oh yeah, when we had
if they're right up in the reservoir, they're going to all the way down, aren't they?
We did a day volunteering cleaning up in the middle of Darlington and Skerne, and we were finding, you couldn't lift anything without them being there.
Yeah.
But we were also finding otter. So there's traces of otter who'd obviously been munching their way through some of that population. and if I told you sort of 10 years ago there'd be otter in the centre of Darlington, you'd probably laugh at me. But actually, there's a food source there. So you've got otter foraging and not doing, unfortunately, enough eating of them, but yeah.
Did salmon ever run the Skerne?
Salmon?
I can't imagine it. I'm just curious.
Don't know if salmon do. I know we do find salmon up the Tees occasionally, but not very often. Obviously, one of the problems we have at the moment is blockages like the barrage fish pass, which wasn't really built for salmon, because nobody thought we'd ever get salmon in the Tees again when they put that in. Who'd have thunk it, eh? And now we have records of salmon further upstream, so obviously they're negotiating whatever pass to get up there, but not enough of them. So we know that there are stories of salmon being trapped trying to move upstream. So we know they can. It's just where they're going. Again, Skerne, I don't think they go that far up, but I do believe they go to a certain sort of shorter sort of stretches, the earlier stretches of it. But we found trout, particularly all the way right up to the top of the Leven up at Kildale. So that there are migratory species getting up some of these rivers, but how they're doing it, we don't quite know.
Well, I thought unlike sea trout, they had to, sea trout will run any river, but salmon have to go up the river they were born in. So if they were wiped out, I understand that restock the Tees, and possibly from what I've seen, all the work's going on up at the Boulder, and maybe the Loon, I don't know, but the Leven, I can't understand that because God, they had restocked the Tees, so now they're getting up there. The Leven, sorry.
Don't know. We also have a story of sturgeon being found not up the sturgeon, not up the Tees, but up and down the coastline where there have been records of them coming up and down. So the thought is if they're actually around the northeast coast, potentially longer term, that might be another species we have to start looking at for how do we get them to be able to migrate up the Tees. And that's a whole new ball game because they're so much bigger. So yeah, I mean that's part of what we're trying to do a lot of the time is not just look at now, and that's where the sort of the ecosystem catchment approach comes from, is look at what's coming down the line, not just in terms of sort of climate change and species that are invasive, but also what benefits, what good species might we get with some of this change as well. And how can we future-proof the river for them before it becomes a problem?
Yeah.
You mentioned kelp, you were looking into a project to do with that. Does that sequester more carbon than seagrass, or is it about the same, or you don't know?
Yeah, the data's still, for UK seagrass especially, the data on carbon sequestration is a bit all over the place. So there's a couple of PhDs looking into it at the moment. I'd probably say yes. So the thing with seagrass is every year it grows to its 2 metre length and then dies back to something quite small or disappears entirely. So that's where you lose some of that carbon benefit. So you get a lot of root mass growth, which is where it will store most of its carbon, but you don't get the constant leaf. Whereas kelp, as far as I know, is more of a round all year and grows quite quickly.
Except you have to harvest it.
Well, it depends if you are, if it's growing naturally or if you're farming it.
I mean, places where seagrass grows, you get these huge beds of the dead leaves.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
I mean, that's not rotting down in a hurry.
No.
I mean, I think all of these things should, I mean, healthy kelp, healthy seagrass, it's all good news.
Yeah,
you
for
know.
sure.
I mean, certainly one thing, I mean, Stan Reaney, one of the North East Division Collective, is absolutely convinced that all the kelp has been killed around him. Environment Agency says it's not a problem, but you know, those sort of things have a big impact. And if we get it back again,
We do have kelp actually in Hartlepool Dock.
Yeah, it's growing.
Yeah.
So it's actually growing in Hartlepool Dock, right next to Stan's boat.
well, but out the front of the headland,
Yeah.
it's just been it's blasted heath there, so to speak. But I mean, you know, once again, as you've said, with your trying to put seagrass in, there are so many factors in this, and it's really good.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. I mean, that was a brilliant talk, very interesting, and great to see what you're up to. So yeah, we can just thank you once more.